It was the Christmas of 1965. This was before man had landed on the moon and before the wall had fallen, before many things that were so good, and before many things had gone bad. For me, it's the last time I knew my innocence, before the creeping shadow which engulfed my family, before madness, before death, before... It was the advent calendar, that damn thing I had to have. Each door a promise of Christmas and each window a missed reminder of warmth and kindness of the festive seasons. I mean, I was 9 years old, and while my parents in my neighborhood would have had no fears for their children in the past, allowing them to play freely in the icy December streets, those days were like a lost breath in a mirror, almost similar to now before the days of Chris Hansen and Dateline. If snow had fallen, there would have been no joy, no snowball fights in the darkened evenings, no sleds, no sliding, carrying free down into nearby fields. Children could not be children. Though the young may have felt apprehension in the dark, it was the parents who were the most fearful, terrified of the ultimate loss and a pain that they could never extinguish. I know I'm talking in this very poetic sense, but just listen to the end. There is a reason for this. For the previous 3 Christmas, without fail, the worst would happen. A child went missing. Well, I was very young. I remember it as though it was all yesterday. The suburban neighborhood where I had lived became the most somber of places. Such a tragedy can do that. Think about it like a slow draining away of any hope or happiness from a community. Almost similar to a way blood would soak out of an open wound. No Christmas tree nor carol sang could stem the flow. The first to disappear was Tommy Graham. He was 11 years old, and although I'd seen him around, I didn't really know him personally. I remember my mother crying about it, though. Just the thought of something happening to a child depressed her greatly. A great amount of empathy I wish I could feel today. And the pain that the parents must have been going through, often on her lips. That Christmas, my dad had held me tighter than he ever done before, and I could tell that they were affected greatly by this disappearance, as well as the rest of the community. The following year, another Christmas came around, and another child was taken. Her name was Sherry. And she was only 4 years old, tiny and fragile. Tears were shed, misplaced rage vented towards the police, who were unable to find her. And by New Year's, it was commonly held to a view that, like Timothy Green a year before, little Sherry will never be found. I, like many of my friends, have been scared by this vanishing child event, this singular yearly thing, almost like a holiday. It was the first time that I became aware that adults could do harm, and even were most vulnerable to us. That children were not always safe, and that those bigger and stronger than us could do unspeakable things on their minds. Yes, I had heard the fairy tales and frightening stories of the Pied Piper and the Boogeyman, but what was most going on in our suburbs was far more gut-wrenching, far more real than any fairy tale I could fucking imagine. Despite this impact, it wasn't until the third child disappearance that I was truly heartbroken. His name was simply Finn, and he was one of my old friends, a close one at that. We lived on the same street, we played football in the fields by his house, and oh god, thinking about it now, it's kind of hard-hitting. But nonetheless, we played football by his house, and we had been walking to school together each day. My dad used to take us to the cinema on Sundays, buying each of us hot dogs, and when we got home, Mom would serve us a beautiful Sunday roast. Finn was almost like a part of my family, and I still think about him to this day. Where would he be now? What would he have done with his life? how diminished have we been not knowing that boy or that adult would have became? No laughs, no tears together, just an empty seat in the cinema, a vacant desk in the classroom. I remember his blue eyes and blonde hair more than anything for the same reason. And the happy-go-lucky nature I miss. I missed him now more than ever, and I wish it were not true. And like the elders, Finn had been snatched from his bed as he slept on the most peaceful of nights, Christmas Eve. His parents had tucked him in, hanging stockings over his fireplace, kissing him on the forehead, not fucking knowing what was gonna happen when he woke up. They woke up expecting to hear the excited scampering of footsteps of their sons rushing down the stairs to see what toys Santa brought, the secret boxes left by the tree, and instead they were left with the sorry sight of no laughs, cheer, or really anything. Just an empty bed. The toys that would never be opened. Just presents sitting there, bought with care and compassion, but now just sitting there, rotting, like their son would soon to be. The parents of all three children would not let it go, could not, nor would they assume the worst. Search parties were organized, flyers were continuously posted through letterboxes, posted onto bulletin boards, shop windows across the city. And the hopes that there would always be somehow, somewhere, the three children would be found unharmed and ready to come home. That year, on the year of the 28th of November, 1965, all hope was extinguished. In an old sewage pipe across town, the crumpled, fumbled bodies of Tommy, Cheryl, and fucking Finn were found stuffed unceremoniously into a corroded pipe in the old sewer, rotting in the sewer waters below, rotting in a cake of human filth. Pain was palpable. The families were inconsolable. And all of us who knew any of the victims, it was too bleak. And snow-riddled Christmas that year was... I'll leave that for you to decide. 3 days later, the mouth turned, eyes moved towards Christmas, and a shaking fear that something cruel and callous lived among us all. 3 children in 3 years, now into the 4th. What would happen that Christmas Eve? Which family would be broken? Which child would be torn from a comfy bed, dreaming of Santa, only to be killed and discarded into a pile of human feces? My parents were nervous, and I couldn't blame them. They sensed change in the atmosphere around streets where I usually played. Families are pulling their children in earlier and earlier before dark came, and at night, on that one occasion, I heard the humming, the hammering, the echoing of the unseen source. With no doubt, windows are being nailed shut to prevent any more children from being snatched as they slept. And on December 1st, my dad hung our Christmas lights outside along the gutter of our roof in little beads of glowing color, piercing through each cold night. We tried to continue on as normal, and we tried to think of happier times. Fuck it, it's still Christmas, and to be frank, we had to enjoy it while we still had it. And I would always hear my dad asking me things like for help. Like, he would always say, "You're my wingman, kiddo," and he would say that behind that big red scarf, climbing up the set of wooden ladders to above the roof. He had flown for the Air Force before I was born and still use a lexicon in those days of the military, but I didn't mind. It made me feel special. In previous years, I had been too small and too young to be of any real use in decorating the outside of our home, but my dad always tried to include me. I think he just liked to do things with me. It had to be a father-like son, let's get that good old 60s mindset going. The standing at the bottom of the ladders, looking up at him, whistling Christmas songs aloud, made me feel a part of the accomplishment, part of the yearly celebrations that December had to offer. However, that December was different. It was the first time I was big enough to go up ladders with him, to look at the old streets below and see the occasional blink from the withered set of lights clinging to the neighbor's fence or home. My mom, albeit, was terrified. She had visions of us both falling to our death, but my dad always seemed so sure of himself. It wasn't arrogant, it wasn't, not knowing or anything like that. It was just confident and cheery, reminding us all that everything would be okay. Looking back, I think that was what I loved about him most when I was a kid. The fact that he had it all in hand and did everything to reassure his family and friends that nothing bad would happen. And I never felt danger up in those ladders, always just love, and I felt safe. Always. There wasn't a moment of regret, or there wasn't that moment of, oh fuck, I shouldn't be up here. Before we came down, I remember looking at the rooftops poking out in the regimented lines from the streets around, and I noticed that the world seemed different from up there. And to me, that appeared to be, there appeared to be a fewer Christmas lights than ever before. That night, I knew what was coming. My mom tucked me into bed as my dad finished hanging some paper ring decorations around my bedroom ceiling, and I always felt that those decorations protected me somehow. I'd stir in the night, scared of the dark, and yet at Christmas time, I believe somehow those pieces of colored paper, that blinking Christmas tree in the other room, that those symbols, those goodwill pieces of decorations would keep any monsterolies hid and away at Dark's Bay. My mom kissed me on the forehead and left the room, and there was my dad standing at the corner with his hands behind his back, smiling. "Well, wingman, you know what time it is?" he said as we both began to chuckle. "Let me see, Dad. Please, let me see," I yelled in a very excited tone. From behind his back, he produced an advent calendar. I leapt for joy across the room and hugged him before snatching it from his hands and driving back under the covers, resituating myself in that cocoon-like formation. Sitting down on the bed as my dad ruffled my hair with his fingers, watching me curiously. He knew I loved getting an advent calendar each Christmas, and I had been worried that I wouldn't get another that year, as he told me most of the shops had sold them out. But Dad, being Dad, he spent hours driving around until he found one. He made sure on the night of December 1st, I'd be the first night of the Advent. And there it was, the calendar, beautifully handmade, crafted drawings on its front, back, those lines sketched with colors, lovingly showed Christmas streets full of lights, loving sights. Beautiful, amazing scenes that we just didn't have anymore. Windows beaming with warm yellow glows, waiting for the night Santa would arrive. And what I loved about each year's advent calendar, the good ones at least, was that they told a story. They showed something wonderful happening. Each door or window would be opened up upon night, revealing a picture, building into what would be a magical climax of just pure fucking Christmas. I love the anticipation of holidays. I love what the advent calendar symbolized, hopes and dreams that Christmas held, not just presents, as though as a child, being a child is a big part of it, but spending time with my family and seeing my grandparents who also gave out decent presents. Getting to play with new toys and getting to have fun with my friends. Christmas dream, right? However, I begun to cry, and almost instinctively, my dad seemed to know what was upsetting me. He asked about Finn, and when he mentioned his name, I sobbed deeper. I It's been a while since his death, and my poor friend would never be able to enjoy those carefree days out with me and my dad, or walk us alongside me laughing or playing. And that date, in my young age, I tried to associate it with the joy of getting presents and seeing family, but it was always bogged down by that sight. That's when my dad says something about death. He said something that will always stay with me. You know something, kiddo? As long as you keep the memory of the people you've lost in your mind, in your heart, they'll always be alive. At least, they'll always be alive to you. So in reality, he would start pointing at my chest and poke it gently. Not enough to hurt, just enough to know that his finger was there. So in reality, Finn is right here. And with those words, I felt soothing comfort over me, and I cried out. My dad tucked me into bed, kissed me on my head, and said goodnight, knowing to leave my bedroom door open slightly, to let some light from the hall in to keep my room from the dark. He had left the advent calendar sitting nearby, and the closed windows facing me from my nightstand, and yet I was more exhausted. And so my thoughts drifted from what lay behind those cupboards asleep and hopefully rested on a more enjoyable state of mind. But that did not occur. I woke up from the night from a horrendous dream about my friend Finn, a little 4-year-old Sherry, and 11-year-old Tommy Graham crushed down in that sewer pipe, the water running over their bodies, into their mouths. One spoke, one laughed, one smiled, only then to be rendered silent by an unknown, brutal hand in the darkness. Finn's voice cried out, garbled and drowned. They'd say things I wouldn't be able to comprehend or understand until I heard. Yes, I remember. I heard one word. Forth and clung to me like no other. It said one simple thing. Run. I leapt out from my bed, soaked in sweat, ready to cry out for my mom and dad, but something strange caught my attention, shaking me to the core. I looked to the advent calendar, to the drawings of the cozy homes covered in snow, their windows beaming out into cold December night, sitting there almost as if I had let it. Yet something was amiss, something which I have no memory of. The first advent door had been opened. The cupboard left ajar to one of my rooms. Stepping forward, the sweat dripped from my hand as I pulled the door back to reveal the secrets of what the calendar had in store for me. In what little there was, I squinted, my mind slowly piecing together a picture of what was behind door number 1. As my eyes adjusted, I recoiled in horror as a sight, and I screamed for my family. And within seconds, the light was on, and my dad appeared, picking me up, consoling me as he had put me back into bed. I pointed feverishly over to the calendar, trying to tell him something awful hid behind that door. But of course, he looked at it and smiled reassuringly. And he just said, "Oh, it's just a happy Christmas scene, kiddo," he said, handing it to me. Looking closely, I could see that the picture changed slightly, just ever so slightly, to depict a old stone bridge covered in snow, children playing on top of it happily. Yes, it was quite harmless, quite the scene. My father left soon, allowing me to drift back, but my mind hazed over 2 thoughts. Finn screaming run in my dream, and what I could have sworn I saw at the first calendar door. The bridge was there, and underneath in the dark, eyes looked out as children were playing gracefully above, eyes which seemed to be wrecked with rage and hate. The next day of school went by quickly, and on my way home, I dragged my feet over the bitter, frozen concrete. Paths of pavement, thinking of Finn and how he always walked with me as my house came into view, and God, I miss those days. I really do. Smiled for moments as the light had been turned on, and they warmed my spirits, but when I entered my room, my soul was chilled, stagnant once more. The next advent calendar door had been opened. Again, originally this was drawn shut. This time I knew I hadn't been there, and I hadn't done such thing in my sleep, as I assumed that I'd been awake during the entire time at school. No, someone opened it. I touched a yellow number 2 on the cardboard door. A number, which should have promised a treat or a happy picture reminding me that Christmas was here. I hesitated and I looked behind it. Another street scene was played out before me. This time, a small boy pulled a red sled behind him as other children threw snowballs at each other, grinning wide and happily. At first, I sighed with relief as the picture seemed to have no hidden intruder, no eyes staring out of the darkness unlike the last one. But just as I sat the calendar back down on my nightstand, I saw it. Right there was a faint outline of a picture looking out towards me, almost invisible, yet hiding within the Christmas scene in plain view. Sitting there on the boy's red sled. I closed my eyes, I rubbed them, fearful that they may reaffirm the figure's presence once more when I opened, but just as the darkened eyes had disappeared from under the bridge on December 1st, the faint outline of the unseen perpetrator for the fucking picture moved on. I knew that no one would believe me, and even worse, I barely believed myself. My 9-year-old mind couldn't comprehend such strange and ominous occurrences. Hell, I really would like to think that I'm fucking insane now, but I'm not. Yet I was not so removed from the idea of horrid things scuttling around in the dark and creatures which parents could not protect you from that the figure had moved on, and I was certain of it. And I knew I must have traveled and must have hid behind door number 3 for December. The next morning, I told myself that I would not open any of the closed doors for the Advent calendar. I promised myself, yet someone or something was doing it for me. That night, I awoke in the darkness once more with another decrepit dream I cannot remember, praying out for poor Finn drowning in that putrid sewer. Crying out in the dark, crying out, warning, pleading, run, run, run. I again leapt from my bed and I saw the calendar door once again. The door was opened by an unseen force, and there in the dark I looked, compelled by fear of not looking. The terror of not knowing what's to come. For in that third picture it became clear to me that something was on its way, something unspeakable was plotting. It was drawing closer. Behind that door laid another Christmas scene. Families skating on beautiful ice under that transparent barrier between the cold air and icy water. There was a shape, dark and indefinite but malevolent. A blurred from under the ice, eyes staring up in disgust at the families who happily skated above. I screamed again, and yet the results were all too familiar. My dad, my mom arrived tired, yet another cry and annoyed that their child was waking them up in the night. Mom put me into bed. She did so as I tried to explain frantically to them both something was appearing in the Advent calendar, that each door had proof of something which meant to do me harm, yet there was no evidence of it. Only 3 open doors showing happiness and fun that Christmas. Dad said that I was just having bad dreams and that I needed to go to bed, and that he and Mom would sit with me for a while until I fell asleep, but nonetheless to do it quickly. I heard them whispering about work in the morning, but they were more concerned about me than losing a few hours of rest. The next day, again, I tried to ignore that Advent calendar. I tried desperately to avoid the doors, and again, I failed. In the night, I woke up from the same horrendous dream. Run, 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 and yet this time the calendar was not opened. The door, with a yellow number, remained closed. I hoped whatever strange thing that was in those pictures had left, that I could forget those haunting eyes, and that I could simply return to enjoying the anticipation of Christmas. But just as I nodded and packed to sleep, happier than I'd ever been since they found Finn's body, I heard something. the sound of a thumb, slowly, or maybe even a finger pulling at that clipboard. And I stared in utter disbelief as I saw the fourth door was being pulled open by an invisible hand in the dark. It is strange that I did not scream, but since then I've heard people say, when you are scared as you could possibly be, that you cannot move, nor can you cry for help. I opened my mouth, but no noise came out. Paralysis of fear was overpowering. There I lay in the night, staring wide-eyed at the fourth door, wondering what disturbing depiction would it reveal. And even more so, I was terrified at whatever opened it still lurked by. I wish I could say that it stopped, that the horrid revelation ceased, but I cannot. Some nights, the dreams of Finn yelling at me, the come and run, but others they did not. The only consistent thing was that at some point in the day, the calendar door would be open. Whether it was at morning or at night, each door would show a happy scene, and each time something hideous, which I could only see, would be momentarily present. One door would show up a group of carolers, cheerfully singing at night, warmed by the glow of an open window, and one at the rear that stood... The glow of an open window, and at the rear stood a outline. Fucking outline. Something watching, something waiting, something moving on relentlessly. And that was at least until we got to Christmas Eve. The last door, another picture, showed a small girl, no older than poor Sherry, who had been killed 2 years previous, placing presents into a stocking. And yet, for another moment, there was the faintest impression of a hand reaching out from the stocking towards the girl, as if it had every fucking intention to pull her in. By the 20th, the horrific pictures had intensified, and as had the dreams. Finn was now screaming my name. His voice was echoing up through the drain, pleading me to get away. As those nightly terrors revealed themselves, the pictures had taken on more weight, more immediacy, for I was certain now that I had been showed the street where I had lived. Yes, the picture was not of something ordinary, but instead it was my very own street, my very own cul-de-sac, my very own house. My dad found me crying that night, and he reassured me that I would be fine, and when he asked me what was wrong, I told him. I believed that there was something evil coming, something horrendous, which had snatched a child of the previous 3 Christmases, the same evil that had taken my friend, that hidden horror, that which on Christmas Eve would come for me. Dad reassured me that that was not the case, that I was imagining things. And when he looked on the pictures on the calendar, he just saw nondescript streets, anonymous faces, nothing what suggested the places where we lived. But I saw differently. The drawings clearly showed, house by house, inch by inch, that something was drawing near each day, fleeting glimpses of a faint figure waiting to gorge itself once more. My dad offered to throw the calendar away if it was upsetting me so much, but I pleaded with him not to. I needed to know what was coming for my own sanity as well as others. I had to see what was coming, what was on its way to snatch me from my family, as if it what had happened to the other children. The 21st, the 22nd, the 23rd of December were torturous, to say the least. While I should have been excited for the Christmas day, I was not. I was fucking terrified. I knew that I would never live to see it. The calendar door on the 21st opened by something unseen as I slept. It showed a house that came into view, one with glowing lights that hung around the roof gutter, and a faint outline of something terrible approaching nearby. I was certain that that house was mine, and that the light that beamed outward to the snowy landscape was from my family. Though as I peered out from night from my window, there was no snow in reality, just biting wind and frost-covered grass Everything like a shroud. I could not figure out what was out there, but I felt it. Somewhere close, just waiting for me on Christmas Eve. On the 22nd, a figure drew closer to our home. As the snow fell around the advent calendar, and on the 23rd, the prowler had reached the gate of our garden. It was supposed to be nondescript scenes, man. That night, I had a terrible vision that in my dream, I found myself laying in the dark. I could not see, and all I was surrounded by empty coldness of winter. Pain coursed through my body. The sound of running water pushed over it, forcing me deeper into the abandoned drain. Putting out my hand instinctively, my fingers touched the frozen mouth of another child. Slowly, it moved against my hand, and I felt stagnant, cold lips as they said 3 simple words. 3 words that will always stick with me and that I'll never forget in my entire mind. It whispered as if it was weakened. Just these words. Run! Get away! I did not wake screaming, nor did I leap from my bed as I had the other nights, like an animal fleeing from a predator. There I lay in the silence of the night, and in the stillness I cried. The paper chains and decorations my family hung that once provided me some warmth, protection, safety, proved no protection from the pain, from the thoughts of 3 children that had been taken, and how I would be next. That was the day had come, Christmas Eve, and I was frightened, but a distance took me. One which slowed my words and left me dispassionate about the festive season, about my family. I wish I had not been that way, and I wish I'd savored every moment I had left, but I was drained. Numbered by the lurking fear which had haunted me for weeks, tired of all the strain, a strain that no 9-year-old should have to bear. My dad knew that I wasn't my usual self, as I normally relished in the Christmas Eve like most children, excited and completely enthused for what was to come, but there I was outside in the cold, helping him fix a part of the lights which had become unhooked due to wind. I watched my dad on the ladders once more, wind rattling everything around him, the slates on the roof and the trees and the gutter. I thought about how Finn's family, or little Cheryl, or even Tommy Green's would have been preparing for Christmas on a day like this, happily unaware of the loss that they were about to undergo. At least I knew I had the foresight of each hideous picture, hinting at the faint figure coming closer to my home. Possible ways he might even take me, like a stocking with a hand in it. Simply going outside the sled only to be pulled into the murky water below. Only maybe I go into the garden and I just, one moment I'm there and one moment I'm not. Maybe he would open my window as I slept, waiting for Christmas morning, to snatch me from my bed, to slaughter me, discarding my body down a sewer pipe. Used and forgotten. As the wind howled and the lights chinked and jingled together, I looked back at our gate to the open garden, to where I had last seen my future attacker, and I could see nothing, just an empty street on the quietest night of the year. But in the absence, I could feel eyes bearing into me. My dad climbed down the ladder, whistling a merrily tune to himself, and as I looked up at him, I simply asked, matter-of-factly, if he would nail my door and window shut. He didn't ask why, he knew. He fucking knew. I mean, everyone had been doing it. He knew many parents had done the same, and so he went inside the evening, and he carried out the promise of the frozen from the outskirts of the city. Dad got his toolbox and drove a large series of nails into the frame of the window. Once I was confident that there was no way to open it, I thanked him and asked if he'd do one more thing for me, to sit by my bed all night and look over me until morning. Unlike the other nights, he did not tell me there was no monstrosity out there, nor did he say that the world was a safe place, for that would have been a lie. He placed his hand gently on my shoulder and said, "If you'll need me, I'll sit right there until it's time to open presents." And sit there he did. My mother came in to kiss me on the head before returning back to the kitchen, where she was preparing things for dinner the next day. So I wanted to see it. Presents meant nothing to me that night. All I cared about was being there at the family table, laughing with Gramps and Gran, and knowing that the nightmare of December 1965 was over. I fell asleep as my dad sat by my bed reading his book. It must have been at least 2 or 3 in the morning when I woke. I was unsure if it was a precise time, but I knew was that my dad was standing by my window, looking down into the street below. I whispered to him and asked what was wrong, but his reply was hesitant. Nothing, kiddo. Go back to sleep." Then I heard it, a certain labor, the sound of footsteps slowly walking up our garden path, shambling forward towards our home. This wasn't normal walking. It sounded as if there was a limp. The sound frightened me, and my thoughts immediately turned to the advent calendar, to the faint outline of the figure that haunted me. From the little light there, I could see that the door of the Christmas Eve was sealed shut, yet to be open. The footsteps continued, one after another, slowly, steadily. My dad stared out intently outside as if he could see anyone out there. But he shook his head in disbelief, because there was no one out there, yet the sounds of footsteps still could be heard. Then that's when the footsteps ceased and silence covered everything from the outside. Suddenly, it was broken by 3 loud, booming knocks. It was at our door, and I cried out in terror, and I started sobbing. "It's come to take me, Dad. It's come to take me like Finn and the others." "Nonsense. It's just our neighbor or something," my dad said unconvincingly. "No, Dad, it's here to take me away." I screamed as I handed the calendar to him, and "Dad, just open the last door. You'll see it. Christmas Eve. Each Christmas Eve, it takes a child, and if you open it, you'll see it. I promise you'll see it." 3 more knocks echoed, and for the last time, I saw my life flicker across my dad's face as I could hear my mom stirring out of her room, shouting as though to ask what's going on. And then once more, 3 more knocks became pronounced. "Please, Dad, look at the door. You'll believe me. It's here for me." My dad's hand trembled as he looked to the calendar quietly, and he held onto the door tightly, slowly opened the last door to see what it was and what it showed. "Oh God, no!" And with that was the most hideous of sounds anyone could ever make. One which was laced with dread. A click of a lock, the turning of a handle, and a front door opening to the cold. Then footsteps climbing the stairs, looking, seeking, and slowly coming towards my room down the hall. "Dad, please help me!" I pleaded as the nightmare thing in our house drew closer. He looked at me and trying his best to hide his fear, but I could see it in his face. I could see right into his soul. "Now listen, son. As soon as I go out there, you need to grab all your things, anything heavy, to barricade your door, and don't let anyone in here unless if it's me or your mother. You got it?" I believe in that moment, I saw utter despair in my eyes. And he could see it. And before he left the room, the footsteps had reached into the one next to mine. He suddenly and gently patted me on the head. "It'll be okay," he said. And that's when he had gone. I did as he said, and as soon as he had left the room, I moved my nightstand, my chair, my book, and anything I could against the door, sobbing my eyes out, praying that my parents were safe. At first, I heard nothing throughout our house. Then suddenly, violent shouting erupted and a struggle followed. What sounded like furniture being thrown, glass smashed, and the worst of it, my mother screaming. She cried and yelled and finally, I couldn't bear it anymore. I couldn't leave her alone. Clearing my things away from the door, I opened it. I wandered down the darkened hall to the cold, icy air below through the house. The front door lay open, decorations strewn about, frozen breeze. Outside knelt my mother alone, terrified, screaming into the night. Losing a parent is hard for a child, and to do so on Christmas Eve is harder. Yet the torture of that night cuts deeper than any wound I have. You can know my true pain, and over the years I have tried to understand it more clearly, understand what my life is before and what it is now, and to little no avail. I can't give solid explanations, nor can I say that my anger will ever truly diminish. I try to live as best as I can, putting my misery out of my mind each year, that is, until Christmas, when memories flood back like a comforting blanket, soon to be torn away by the silent hand in the dark. My own children are now grown up, and they've asked me why I'm a little distant around this time of year, and I've given no real answer. And all I can say is this: I do know two things, both which haunt me to this day. The first is that no one ever saw or heard from my dad again. My mother remained tight-lipped until she died. About what had come to our house that night, about what took her husband. And to be frank, who could blame her? I also know what the last Advent calendar contained, and what had frightened my dad so badly. It was a drawing like the others, a happy Christmas scene with one horrid addition. It showed a boy sleeping soundly in his bed on Christmas Eve. A child who looked uncannily like poor Finn, unaware that his life would soon be over, and that he was being watched through the frosted window by his own killer, whose face looked remarkably like my father's. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm your host, That Creepy Reading, here to give you another story review. Full disclosure I should mention is that I actually know the author of this one, Michael Whitehouse. He's a really cool dude, and if you're listening to this, Michael Whitehouse, thanks for watching. And here's my official plug for Michael Whitehouse's channel. You can find him here. Although I'm not very good at writing stories due to my own disabilities, I can at least send you to someone who knows what he's talking about. With that being said, this story is amazing. One of the best I've ever read, to be frank. I mean, like, I've been reading through a mire of gaming creepypastas and things that are passable, but when I come across something like this, it really puts those other stories to shame. The story is written in a coherent way. It's very poetic at the beginning and not creepypasta-like, and although it makes it, I mean, I would assume, at least listening to that, the poeticism in the story would make it a little bit hard to take it seriously at the beginning, at least, because, again, there's a lot of situations and things that are kind of hinted at and put in a very, again, poetic context. I have to say, for the time of the story supposedly being written, again, 1965, the idea of Advent calendars being creepy and the everlasting dread of your days quite literally being numbered is something that is ever prevalent in this story. I absolutely love how Michael Whitehouse includes the idea of the counted days, and the only thing I wish is that we could have more of a focus on the days leading up as opposed to the events beforehand. I mean, I think we could have honestly cut out Sherry. We could probably Sherry and Timothy Green and not care about their children and just left it at the death of Finn, who was his friend. Maybe do a little bit before Finn died, where there's actually some dialogue between the two, and then have him die for his death to be a little bit more tragic and actually hit home more. I compensated with my own narrator's tricks. Not to mention, I should mention that I do have acute dyslexia, and some of the words got swapped around, so the writing in this is actually pretty good. It's just that sometimes I may have swapped around a few words due to being a dyslexic. Again, it's something that's selective and only happens occasionally, but if you actually read the story, you probably heard it, and I really do recommend you check out Michael Whitehouse's story. I found this story through the creepypasta.com, and they had like a tag for Michael Whitehouse, so that should really tell you how good he is. Michael Whitehouse did a fantastic job on this story. Throughout the entire tale, there is him talking and him speaking about how friendly his dad was, up until the final part where you get to the reveal, which was, to be frank, I wasn't expecting it. It was odd, and you would think that this would be a supernatural tale of a invisible creature haunting him, and to be frank, it might have been, but in the end, the mystery behind who did it, was it really his dad, and all that really helps the story be compelling enough. It's a very easy read for at least a person of my stature. I believe I'm at a college reading level, and it's absolutely amazing. By the way, I should mention that Michael Whitehouse has his own books, and Jesus Christ, Michael Whitehouse, you are absolutely amazing. So hats off to you, man. I'm glad to have read this story, and yeah, you can find his channel in the description and all that magical stuff. Keep in mind that if you donate money to my Patreon as of right now, you can send me a personal message and I'll make any kind of video or read any story that you want me to do. This is a limited time author up until I get my house fixed. The insurance company is working on that. But just understand that I am in a kind of tight position where I don't even think I have a mailbox right now. So, yeah. If you want to donate to my Patreon, you get to pick a story and or video type of your choice, rents a fitting music, all the way on to a crappy pasta, anything you would like. So yeah, have a good one. This has been your host, That Creepy Reading, and please bear myself plugging. Glad you enjoyed the video.